Hey guys. All right. So, demographics is something that's not new to me as a concept, but understanding it as it has progressed in modern history is. I was only introduced to demographics as an interplay to finance, and I think it's woefully misunderstood. I think its effects are woefully understated, and I think it's super relevant. I'd like to start this off from a very conceptual level. Again, almost everything I like to do is just to build a framework and base it on my understanding of the world and extrapolate out and test the assumptions of that extrapolation. So let's begin very simply. Axiom one: all humans consume. All humans consume. From the time you are born to the time you die, consumption is embedded into your existence. You breathe, you eat, you drink, you sleep, shit, everything. Since your exact creation, you must consume. Now, consumption varies over time. Children tend to consume less than an adolescent, which tend to consume less than necessarily uh, somebody. Now we're getting more monetary here, less food and energy consumption, but typically, the more affluent you become, which tends to be correlated more so to your peak productivity, your propensity to consume increases. So there is a distributional outcome, a distribution here for in terms of consumption relative to age. But on the whole, you are always a consumer. In terms of what you consume in the world that we live in today, where people correlate time and energy, so energy and money, this was something that we'll get more nuanced in later. But for the purposes here, you contribute your time, your energy, your capacity as a laborer to the production of goods and services. And now those aren't necessarily the goods and services that you end up consuming, but you contribute value, value add into the ecosystem. So at points in time in your life, you are a producer of goods as well as a consumer. For the mathematics to work out here, there need to be more production of goods than consumption, or else, in the lack of the ability for those goods to be in the scarcity of those goods, consumption either falls or there has to be some balancing of this equation. Extrapolating more or providing more contextualization for the production value here, traditionally, your propensity to produce is low depending on your geographical location, what country you exist in. Your propensity to produce is low to zero prior to puberty, let's say. In the more developed world, it tends to be that your propensity to produce is not non-existent or non-consequential until about 20. Some individuals even later. But let's just make an assumption here. 20 is the beginning of your production value. Some people don't produce anything until they're 15, some later till 25. Again, it's probably a poor assumption, but just for the concept. And you continue to produce up until retirement, and then you don't necessarily stop production because there are still ways you can give back to society through community assistance or babysitting services or your propensity to produce some other hobby. But again, assumption here, your capacity to produce typically terminates with retirement. And let's just make that 70 for simplicity's sake. In this world that we're talking about, the average age tends to run, let's just make another assumption, 80. Again, incorrect. But for the purposes here, we can go back and we can change this analysis later. So between 0 and 20, you consume, but you don't produce. Between 70 and 80, you consume, but you don't produce. And between 20 and 70, you produce and you consume. And you must produce more than you consume for the mathematics to balance out here, such that consumption and production are near one another. Or in the optimal case, production is greater than consumption, which is probably also a pretty poor assumption. Tying that in, what you consume changes over time as well. As a baby, you tend to consume less than if you are an adult, but less than what? Food consumption is less than. Monetarily, do you consume less as a baby or as an adolescent? Depends a lot on where you're from, your culture, uh, what is going on at your time. Individuals going through a depressionary environment that some would argue today is, which again, I don't necessarily believe that to be true or exactly believe that to be true, but I also see consequentially that there is a decrease in growth. So it depends on how you define depression. But in a depressionary scenario, people's consumption propensity decreases. Because going back to my first video, supply dictates demand. There is always a reflexivity to where if supply becomes constrained, demand tends to fall, assuming all things stay equal. Why this matters? Demography matters. Propensity to consume, propensity to produce, the consumption production balance is in essence a function of demography. As you become older, so where this matters is demographics are inextricably linked to consumption and production, the function of production and consumption. Traditionally, demographics followed a pyramidal structure where younger populations were larger than the cohort above them and above them and above them. So 20-year-olds were greater than 40-year-olds, which were greater than 60-year-olds, which were greater than 80-year-olds. It created a nice uniform pyramidal structure based on the higher propensity to die as you got older. Affluence, industrialization, and subsequent urbanization has created a world where not only have we extended life, so in places like China since the 1950s, we've had expansions in the expectation of life, the average age of death, go from 40s to 80s, whereas in the developed world, it hasn't been as egregious, but we've also experienced almost ubiquitously in locations where urbanization was popular, that the propensity to have kids decreased significantly. And there's this concept in demographics where replacement level is important. So for every woman in a population, there needs to be 2.2 to 2.1 children, depending upon infant mortality and a variety of other factors, in order to compensate for the two individuals required to produce that child. Without replacement, mathematically, every generation that passes will result in a halving of not necessarily every generation, but every life expectancy that passes will result in a halving of the population. Just conceptualized. In a society of 100 people, if each individual gets together with another individual and there are 50 relationships and each relationship only produces one child, then eventually you only have 50 children in that cohort that come forward. So the population, it goes from 100 to 150 until the first 100 pass away. But then subsequent, those 50 individuals only then have one child, which results in 25. And assuming again the original 100 are still alive, that's 175 as a population. But at some point, that 100 will pass, and then you'll be left with 75, and then it'll subsequently continue in this parameter until either the number of children per family or per woman increases, or the population dies out. So there's a corrective nature in society where this compacting of people and trapping them in an urban environment changes the dynamic of what a child represents. This is Peter Zeihan's work now, and this is other individuals' work now, but I love the quote, so I'm definitely going to steal it. Children on a farm or in a rural environment are free labor. Who doesn't love free labor? I mean, except in very poor instances of human history where free labor was abused. But in the regards to kids, free labor is awesome. In a city environment or in an apartment or an 800 square foot loft, a child is an expensive piece of furniture who consumes and is probably the worst roommate you will ever have. I don't remember many dynamics having a roommate where you'd have to clean up after them, wipe their ass. It's a very fundamentally different dynamic when you move a child from farm to city. As a result, successful, in quotations, economically and financially prosperous communities tend to have less children. You can see that across socioeconomic trends. You can see that across countries. You probably even see it in your own family structures. Italians today do not remember how to have kids. No offense to the Italians. Neither do Greeks. Neither do any society. The more affluent, the less religious, the more incorporated into an urbanized structure we become, the less likely we are to have kids. And this has massive implications. By design, humanity is a Ponzi scheme. Obviously, I don't mean that via the Gini coefficient, or via some other. I'm sorry, Gini coefficient is the incorrect term, but I don't mean it in a very literal sense. But there is an expectation that output is correlated to productivity multiplied by population growth. Productivity increase or decrease multiplied by population growth or added to population growth. Our history is replete with only one trajectory for populations, up. Populations only ever increased in the past. There are instances where famine, disease, death via war or other conflict resulted in a decreasing of the population abruptly, which had drastic economical effects. But we've never had, to my knowledge, a trajectory of the population of the world that faced downward. Almost everywhere across the developed world, and even pretty consistently in the developing world, that we are now experiencing instances without immigration, which there's only a few countries in the world that really experience net immigration. But we're now experiencing instances where that 100 example of 100 families or 100 individuals in a society only having one child is not as far-fetched as it once was. Um, China enforced a one-child policy in the 70s that they allowed to be maintained for 30 years. 30 years is not necessarily a whole lifespan, but it's a large chunk of that lifespan. And 30 years later, you have some of the smallest, not some of the smallest sizes for high school children or high school graduates that you've had in a preponderance of time, 60, 70 years, 80 years, since the size of the Chinese country was much smaller. This has mass implications. This Ponzi element to society means that you must always be expanding the populace, because if you do not, the goods and services that were left behind, the goods that were produced before, get the dynamic shifts much more in the consumption dynamic. If you consider what this means, if a consumer is a consumer of a good and service, and a producer is a producer of a goods and service, and historically populations only ever rose, that means since everyone is a consumer, but not everyone is a producer, that the consistent growth of populations resulted in inflationary pressures, more consumers chasing after less goods and services. Now, it's not a direct correlation to populations. It has more to do with the distributions of the populations. If for whatever reason you had 100 million people in a population and they all were between the ages of 0 and 20 and 70 and 80 and are an extreme example, you are not going to get inflation. Actually, the opposite. You're going to have all consumers with no production. So I said it backwards. If you had that demographic cohort, 0 to 60 and 70 to 80, you'd have only inflation and an extreme amount of demand to no production. So you wouldn't be able to meet those needs. So goods and resources and services would be very scarce. And the exact opposite, if you have a generation where everyone is between the ages of 30-ish, roughly 20 to 70, as we defined in our example, in that example, production is way outstripped. And it's a little even more nuanced than that. Your production capacity tends to peak post 40, 45. In your 50s and 60s, you are a master of your trade. Your value add, your efficiency tends to be at the highest it can be. Again, depending on the nature of your work. If it's very physical, there might be physical limitations there. But if your work is very logistic, or it has more to do with like supply chains or mass manufacturing or machinery or some element that you typically get more proficient at times, that 40 plus demographic tends to be very highly skilled relative to the 20 to 40 demographic, my demographic. So what am I trying to get at here? The world is not as it once was. It's different this time, but it's different this time in a very objective, measurable way. The reaction function, the reflex here, is not well understood. So there's some leniency in that regard. But where there is not leniency, where there is not any sort of wiggle room in the argument, is we are not having as many kids. The population of the world is petering out. The assumptions embedded in, say, the UN's projections for population growth hitting 11 billion make very wrong assumptions that are just not understood, not observed in society today. Current projections by other demographers suggest we'll peter out and max out in population at 8 to 9 billion, and that makes some other assumptions as well. One of the assumptions I saw: the two largest countries to exist in our on our Earth is India and China. Well, as of 9 months ago or 10 months ago, we're in August of 2021, so late 2020, early 2021. There was this argument that India is hitting this population replenishment level, the 2.2 children per woman. China, for the longest time, has been citing uh, re- uh, the number of children per family as like 1.6 or 1.5, and in its own admission recently has admitted that it's more like 1.4, where some demographers internally within China have suggested it's more like 1.2 or 1.3 or 1.4. And the slight zero point 0.1, that one tenth of a child difference is humongous. It has massive implications because this is the exponent form function within population growth and contraction. So zero point 0.5 in one direction, um, so two children for family, to 2.5 results in about a 1 billion increase in the number of people born in India that you'd expect, or population size in India that you'd expect. And a zero point 0.5 decrease under 2 results in a decrease of about a billion people over some arbitrary length of time. I'm actually not sure of the figures. I'm speaking without the data in front of me. So my point here is the world we've known has always been about more. Specifically in this case, more people. People are consumers and producers. New entrants to the world are consumers, which are inflationary. But when you stop having children, you get to this sweet spot where there are richer people, more affluent people hitting their stride without the consumption burden that is a child, because children don't there's also another difference. Children consume in a very different way than retirees do. Retirees consume from, theoretically, either the government's handouts or, hopefully, more so from their own retirement portfolios. Children consume directly from the portfolios of their parents' income. It has a lot of implications. I don't like this video particularly because it's running a little longer than I'd like, and I didn't really articulate things as I'd like. So I'm probably going to refine this. But conceptually, it's different this time. There is nuance in demographics. These demographics have wide-ranging implications for economies, the stability of this export-import driven world, the scarcity function as to what's more scarce, goods and services, or the consumer of those goods and services. In a world where demographies are collapsing and society or populations as a whole are decreasing or potentially flattening out to a decreasing function in the next 10, 20, 15 years, you may actually have an instance where consumption is the primary desire. That goods and services are ubiquitous, but it is actually consumption of those goods and services that are what's lacking. Anyway, nice chatting. Hope to do it again another time.